of marine zones, and the map looked like that, as I said, in the 1990s. From the back of the room, most of you probably can't see any colour but light blue, dark blue and green. We realised in the late 1990s we weren't actually doing our job. We weren't protecting the biodiversity of the Great Barrier Reef. So I went through a major rezoning program, and today the zoning plan looks like that, quite different. If you look at the percentages in the table, you'll see the old percentages and then the new. So if you look at, for example, the green zones, the Marine National Park zones, that went from less than 5% of the entire area to now 1/3 of the Great Barrier Reef. So 1/3 is now no-take. A further 1/3 is in what we call the habitat protection zone, which effectively stops trawling. So from a conservation point of view, that's really important as well. It's not just about no-take, it's also stopping the trawling and any activities that's affecting the bottom. But we still have 1/3 of the Great Barrier Reef where all reasonable types of fishing can occur. I've just put up there the different categories. So again, this is stressing to people that within the one MPA, we have a range of IUCN categories, from Category 1, which is our scientific reference area, right through to Category 6, which is the least restrictive of the IUCN categories. So we have all those categories in the one MPA. This is a diagram showing the process we went through to get the new zoning plan. I won't spend a lot of time on it, but I want to stress that in going through this process, and it took about 5 years, at the very start, science played a really important fundamental background. A collation of information from scientists was really important. The scientists also helped us develop a series of planning principles. I haven't got time to talk a lot about those, but I want to stress that those planning principles, again, were very important in helping us do the plan. But having got that good science background, by law, we're required to go into 2 phases of public comment. The first phase was when we asked people to help us develop a new plan, and the second phase was when we asked the public to comment on a draft plan. So we had a draft zoning plan, public comments, and then a final zoning plan. So as I said, this whole process took about 5 years. It was very intensive in terms of public participation. In those 2 phases of public comment, we received 31,000 public written submissions. We'd never received that sort of public input before, and we had to learn how to deal with it. But it was an important part of achieving the new outcome to take on board those public comments. And let me show you just how important that was. This is a very small part of the zoning plan, or a very small part of the marine park, the draft zoning plan that we published in mid-2003. I'm going to now show you the final zoning plan for exactly the same area. So from the draft to the final, if I just go back again, draft to the final, you can see huge changes. We still maintained our planning principles. We still, for example, maintained a large number of no-take areas, but we did so by taking on board the public comments, and in this case, missing areas that were important for fishermen and important for other users. So from the draft to the final, radically different changes, but still achieved our overall objective of maintaining, conserving the Great Barrier Reef, but allowing for sustainable use. So if we think, what were the main success factors in the rezoning? I think there were a number of factors. The fact we used the best available scientific information, but I stress best available. We didn't go out and do any special surveys. We said we'll use the best available, and as we went through, if more information came on board, we took that into account. The second thing, we had very high levels of public input. The third one, and this was critical, we had very effective leadership, both within our agency. The CEO of our agency was a very effective ex-politician who knew to lead us through this planning process, but she also was able to convince the ministers and the other politicians of the importance of this. So without that leadership, I don't think we would have succeeded. And it was that the social and the political support which was the fundamental thing. So what I've said there, all four aspects were essential, but I can't stress enough the latter three. What I'm trying to say is that science is really important, but I see a lot of people around the world saying we need more science or more information. In our case, that wasn't the situation. In our case, it was the public involvement, the leadership, and the political support. I want to quickly talk about, and this is something you may have heard about, there are a lot of tools being spruiked around the world to help planners do more effective planning. This was one that was used in the Great Barrier Reef called Marxan. But I want to stress, and these three little diagrams show the difference between what Marxan could produce in the top diagram. And Marxan is a decision support tool that helps you make better decisions. But Marxan is just a tool. It can't take into account the political implications, and it's only as good as the information you have to put in. So the middle map shows the draft zoning plan, and the bottom map shows the final. And again, if you compare the draft and the final to what Marxan was telling us, you'll see there are, in some cases, good correlations, but many cases, none at all. So I'm stressing here that decision support tools are just that. They're not the answer. And I think a lot of people are being, maybe con is the wrong word, but misled by decision support tools as providing the planning outcomes. So I've talked about a number of things. I've talked about zoning and I've talked about marine spatial planning. This is how I see them fitting together. At the bottom, we've got a whole series of management tools, and I'd like in a minute to take you through an example. But tools, things like permits, things like planning, site plans, and education. Ocean zoning is a really important tool for us, but it's only part of what marine spatial planning is about. And marine spatial planning is really, again, only part of what we need to do to get effective marine conservation. We need to think, as I said, way outside the marine, up into the catchment, addressing those issues in the wider ecosystem. So this is another way of showing it. Marine or ocean zoning is only one of the tools we use. What I've shown there in the dark blue are some of the original tools we had when we first started in 1975. We had legislation, we had the ability to apply permits, we had the ability to do education, and we conducted surveillance. But we learned through our experience that those were only some of the tools. And what I've shown in orange are many of the other tools that have evolved. What I'd like to show you now is just how some of those are applied on top of the zoning. So if we think about managing fisheries, as a management agency, we don't actually manage fisheries. That's done by the state of Queensland. But our zoning that we put in place does have an impact on where fishers can fish, and our zones in some ways can define some of the types of gear they can use. But fisheries is actually managed by many other tools. Things like the plans that they do with their bag limits and their size limits, their gear restrictions, those are all done by the state of Queensland and are not done through our zoning. A second example is shipping. What I've shown here is the shipping lanes, and you can see in those red exclusions, those are the ports. So in the bottom centre is the Port of Townsville where I live, and you can see the shipping lanes come into the port, but they go right across the top of the zones. So a shipping lane in this case is across a green zone, across a blue zone, and in some cases across yellow zones. So the shipping layer is actually another layer on top of the underlying zoning. And in reality, we use a lot of other management measures to manage shipping. The fact we have compulsory pilotage on ships. The fact that we require mandatory ship reporting when the big ships are going past certain points. And the whole area is declared a particularly sensitive sea area. So again, I'm trying to stress that management is multiple layers. In this case, we're talking about tourism and recreation. This is a small part of the Great Barrier Reef, which is very highly used and important for conservation near the island of Hinchinbrook. But what we use for managing is many other tools, and the permits in this case is a very important tool for managing tourism. Each permit is individually assessed, and each permit has various conditions which determines how that tourism can operate. We use a lot of best practice guidelines with industry.